Okay, good morning and welcome to this ZC3 Thought Leaders webinar. For those new to this format, these are regular online events hosted by Mobility Ways to support learning and collaboration on transport decarbonisation topics. For those new to Mobility Ways, we are a leader in transport decarbonisation and the leader in tackling commuting emissions through our comprehensive Measure, Reduce, Report framework. My name is Graham Bannister, and I lead Mobility Ways interactions across several sectors, including 3Cs, councils, construction, and consultancies, which takes us nicely back to ZC3. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Keith Mitchell, Senior Consultant at Stantec. Keith will shortly share key findings from a detailed investigation Stantec undertook alongside other organisations to consider how to improve the design and build of places that will allow future communities to thrive and, at the same time, live within our planet's environmental limits. The report, Bridging the Gap, was published in November 2023. Today is an opportunity to better understand and discuss the overall approach and outcomes. Keith will be presenting for around 30 minutes, leaving time for questions, so please add these through the Q&A function. But before Keith, a little bit of opening context to this session from myself. I believe most on this webinar would agree that we are not making progress on transport decarbonisation. The data underpinning the challenge is compelling. First slide here. Just earlier this month, perhaps some of you have seen that data was published by the government in terms of latest greenhouse gas emission data by sector. Domestic transport, as you'll see on the slide, as a proportion of overall footprint, has decreased the least since 1990, and in the course of the year has increased the most. So domestic transport now accounts for 28% of the entire footprint of the UK, which is equivalent to the combined size of industry and electricity supply. Next slide. And there is some quite interesting things going on. So whilst on the left-hand side of the slide, we can see that cars on average are getting cleaner. So we're starting to see shoots related to electrification and just generally improving efficiency of ICE vehicles as well. But actually, despite that, hybrid working, the fact that we are hybrid working, one of the factors that actually led to a significant reduction in transport emissions in 2020. So whilst hybrid working remains, actually, we're on a trajectory right now for road emissions to return and exceed pre-COVID levels. And if you can see from the data, it is road that is the contributing factor towards the increasing return back to 2019 levels of circa 120 megatons. Next slide. And related into all of this is what's going on in terms of patterns and behaviours. We run an annual zero carbon commuting conference. It was in, I believe, October of last year, and it will be similar time this year. But some of the key insights that came from that point towards challenges. And again, this is about pointing out data that's leading us to what we need to do, which is better collaboration. So we can see that since 2015, road network speeds have worsened by an average of 4%. And the forecasts are pointing towards increasing congestion, so 30% worse by 2030 and 70+% worse by 2050. We also have challenges when it comes to vehicle occupancy. So whereas for the commute, it's really quite close to 1.1, what we want to see, what we need to see to help alleviate some of the challenges we're seeing in the road network with congestion is occupancy rates increasing to 2, perhaps ideally above 2. So that we can really make some dent into congestion at peak times. And just the scale of the opportunity, I would say, so yes, it's challenging, but there are opportunities, is the sheer volume of empty seat miles that are driven every year, just from lone commuters. Next slide. My final piece in terms of the setting some context is just to recognise where we are. So actually, 71% of us feel they need a car to suit their current lifestyle. That's actually really important. I think Keith will touch on this. This isn't about demonizing car use. We need people to use their car less. We need more people to use their own car less. But within there is recognition that the car serves a purpose. It's about just re-engineering, reconfiguring how we use that car, so that we're actually using the best mode for the most appropriate trip. So that's just some context. Okay, so if you like, that was the appetizer. Now we're on to the main course. Keith, welcome, and thank you again for joining us today. Over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Graham. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to talk about this piece of work that we've been doing over the last couple of years. But its gestation has been much longer than that. I'm a transport planner. I've been working in transport planning since around 1984. In those days, it was probably called more traffic engineering than transport planning, but we've evolved a little bit. But over that period of time, policy has changed. In 1994, we saw a move towards more sustainable land use and transport planning in PPG 13. There have been other markers along the line, but how much really has changed in terms of the way in which we deliver development, deliver infrastructure, and get outcomes in terms of people's travel behavior? And the answer to that is unfortunately not very much. And as a result, having had very nearly 40 years in the industry watching this process, this study has been a bit of a response to, a frustration about seeing the way in which policy has been evolving, but yet not being able to create change on the ground, and trying to understand why that might be. Clearly, some of that is around the relationship between people and their cars and people and what they want to do being very different from what policymakers want to do. But it's also about us probably not pulling the right levers. So looking at this sort of background has been a pretty important part of why this study has been taking place, and it's been an important part of why it's been undertaken in a very collaborative way, not really only Stantec, but very much with academia and the public sector, to try and make sure that we're pulling together all of the relevant thoughts into this process. Okay, thank you. Can we move the slide on, please? Thank you. Excellent. So transport decarbonisation. What is the challenge? Graham has set the context extremely well. I don't really need to go over this other than to say, in order to meet net zero, the Climate Change Committee's 6 carbon budget pathway requires emissions to fall across all sectors and at a faster rate than we've been achieving over the last 30 years. Domestic transport emissions are the largest sector. We've heard just now 28% of UK emissions in 2022. Of this, over 90% emissions relate to road transport. Next slide, please. And as I had my little gentle rant at the beginning, transport has been the laggard sector. We've made significant progress in some other sectors, but in transport, it's been extremely slow progress. And some work has been undertaken to look at exactly what progress has been made and what progress might be made under our now current policy to decarbonise the transport system by Greg Marsden. He published a report called Reverse Gear in May 23. And this graph is a graph that's been pulled out of that. I don't intend to try and pull you into the detail of this, other than to say, if I could just move on to the next slide, which hopefully will explain this. There is a finite amount of carbon that the transport sector can generate and still stay within the carbon pathway. That is the lower line underneath the red space on that graph. The upper line represents where current policy sits, and the arrows show where it is trending. And the bar chart above, the difference between the red bar and the green bar basically shows the difference between current policy and the amount of carbon we're likely to generate under current policy, and the amount of carbon that should be generated within the 6 carbon budget pathway. And you can see that there is a significant gap between them. The way Greg Marsden explained it to me was that there was a significant carbon reduction as we entered the pandemic and we went into lockdown. You would need 10 years of those pandemic lockdowns in order to reach the same level of carbon reduction represented by that carbon gap. And that, I think, helps just to bring it to life a little bit. So the critical thing to note out of these 2 slides here is that it's not just about the scale of CO2 reduction, but also the pace at which we achieve it. Because unless we're turning the corner and bringing this curve back down to the pathway, then the gap just continues to widen. Okay, next slide, please. So if you were to look into the future and say, right, we envisage a future in which we're going to achieve those carbon reductions, and we're going to create a place which supports travel, which is more at a level that is more consistent with the 6 carbon budget pathway, it is actually quite difficult to do. We have been building suburban housing outside of the main city centres that looks very much like this, with the results of car-dependent lifestyles. And we've been doing that for very many years. And we have all culturally sort of been brought up with thinking that that's the way that housing is, and the infrastructure that supports it. And yet one of the things that we want to try and do here is to try and reimagine that world, and reimagine a world in which the places we live and the people that live in those places can be making different choices without those feeling as though that they're difficult or having to go out of their way in any particular way. If we move on to the next slide. Over the next few slides, there's quite a lot of numbers and detail. So what I'm going to try and do is tell you the story over the top of these numbers, and I'm not really asking anybody to get into the detail. The slides will be available afterwards if anybody does want to get into the numbers. But this is there really to just help to tell the story. So the study began really by looking at alternative futures. What might these alternative futures look like, and what would happen if we were to follow those alternative futures in terms of the carbon that they would generate from a transport perspective. And we used Transport for the North's future travel scenarios. Those future travel scenarios were developed 2 or 3 years ago to enable this sort of research to take place, and in order to enable strategic planning in the north of England to take place. They looked at 4 different future scenarios. They called them Just About Managing, which was basically a bit of a sort of good version of what we're doing now. Prioritized Places, which was about encouraging as much travel to take place locally as possible. Digitally Distributed, which was a sort of technology-led future built around mobility service, pay-as-you-go mobility services, shared autonomous vehicles and the like. And an urban zero carbon world, which it imagined higher density development around mass transit. And of those 4, there were only really 2 potential scenarios of interest that got us anywhere close to being able to return to a Climate Change Committee's 6 carbon budget pathway. bit of a mouthful. Sorry about that. So, so there were two potential scenarios of interest. One was an extended ambition version of urban zero carbon, and a significantly extended ambition version of the digitally distributed or technology-led scenario. But both of those still required a further reduction in travel distance by car, and therefore carbon generated, in order to meet that pathway. And that was calculated for urban zero carbon as being a 20% reduction in travel distance by car by 2030 and retained thereafter. And for digitally distributed, the number was over 30%. So you can imagine, I think, with those numbers, that those are very significant challenges indeed. Next slide. So what we embarked upon as part of the study was then to try to consider what those futures would look like if we really supercharged them, if we really, threw everything and the kitchen sink at them in order to try and achieve those levels of reduction in travel demand by car. And we did this on the basis of a real place, but a hypothetical development plan. So the real place that we worked with was in Bury. There are two sites in Bury: the Zelton Reservoir, which is a residential site, which is on the left of this slide, and there is Northern Gateway, which is actually the major employment site for Greater Manchester, which sits smack on the motorway network, and is designated for something like 10 million square feet. And so we use those, the ideas that these places would become developed over the course of the next 15 and 20 years, that the local area would be changing, and its local transport plan and local plan would be developing and be taking forward its proposals for transport. And we were trying to consider what changes each of our different place-based scenarios would look like. So either just about managing, which was we took as our baseline, digitally distributed or technology-led scenario, and an urban zero carbon scenario. So for each of those, each scenario for the Elton Reservoir housing site had a different place typology. So for just about managing, it looked like a typical suburban housing development with 3,500 homes on it. In the digitally distributed world, it was a slightly higher density suburban development with no cars on the drive, no cars on the streets, remote parking in parking barns with charging provided, and local mobility hubs around the site with 4,000 new homes. And the urban zero carbon scheme, nearly 6,000 homes on the site, much higher density, and built very closely around the tram network, which is over on the right-hand side of this, with a new tram stop at Elton, an existing tram stop at Radcliffe, with access being provided both to Bury Town Centre and to Greater Manchester. So those were the sort of basic features of each of the supercharged futures that we were going to be examining. Thank you. Next slide. So the first thing was you really need to do is understand the local movement context. Where are people going? Where are people? At what time are people going? Why are they going there? What other pressures are there? Other link trips that are relevant to this? And the most obvious thing that stands out when you look at this slide, the slide, the box up on the left-hand side. On top right-hand side, is that there is a very diverse and disperse level of trip making, which has destinations all over the place, very hard to replicate by public transport. The second thing is that that Bury has a very good level of local facilities, but there are gaps in local facilities which are provided in the local urban area, and we looked at some detail to find out where those gaps were and to try and make an assessment of whether or not, if we provided, for example, health facilities, GP clinics, pharmacies, local retail, community hubs, and the like, would those have the impact of being able to create more local travel patterns? The most clear thing that came out of all of this were the analysis of the local movement context was that whilst there was a lot of short journeys, under 2 kilometers, and a good size of shortish journeys between 2 and 5 kilometers, the big carbon generating journeys were over 5 kilometers, and mostly beyond the reach of existing strategies around active modes. And so we have a local context in which local movement is clearly important and local facilities well used, but trips are extremely diverse, and the high carbon generating trips that we need to try and influence if we're going to seriously reduce carbon are many of them are beyond the reach of active modes. And so there is a real challenge about how you go about trying to provide, either in a technologically led world or an urban zero carbon world, what the transport systems would be that would be attractive enough to provide an alternative to the car. Okay, let's move on. So what we did was to run a workshop. We ran a workshop with all of the various stakeholders involved, and we put together a plan for a land use future and a transport future for both the digitally distributed world and for the urban zero carbon world. And what we were trying to do was to create to rebalance the decisions that we make when we leave home, and use design so that we're making fewer unconscious decisions to go and use the car. And that means making parking more remote, more constrained, and making sure that other alternatives can get to the front door when people need them. The second thing we did was to think about how we moved investment away from providing for additional car use, but we were providing investment instead towards effective provision for either mass transit in the urban zero carbon world or for local mobility services in the technology-led world. And invest it in that world, particularly investing in priority for those local mobility services over and above those that would have otherwise been provided by car. And it's that switch of investment from car to other modes, still investing in the road network, because that's where people are working, but reinventing how roads would be used is an important part of that particular thought process. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide. So this is where we start looking at, in much more detail, at each of the futures and paint a picture of urban zero carbon, high density mixed use development. As we said, nearly 6,000 homes on that site, based around mass transit, digitally distributed, suburban, what we called vehicle to community. In other words, there were both parking and charging hubs, both saving energy costs and changing the balance between attractiveness of car and attractiveness of other modes. And investing in the development of local pay-as-you-go mobility services, and investing in the provision of local facilities and amenities within the development and surrounding the development, and ensuring that access to those is as convenient as possible, taking priority over routes being provided for cars. So these two places were designed in some level of detail. Thank you very much. And we then set out to understand from a technical perspective what the outcomes of that might be. Now, it was beyond the scope of our work to do any detailed transport modelling of all of this. But what we did do was to look at at a sort of vision-led approach to understanding the changes in movement that would be needed in order to deliver our 20 or 30% reduction in travel demand. And what we found was that one, we found it's extremely difficult. Two, we found that we had to focus a lot of our available investment from these places into access to the main destinations, and that meant investment in commuting trips, investing in changing commuting trips, investing in changing trips to school, those where there are high density trips in one direction, which can be affected by investment in either mass transit or mobility services. But the level of that change, for example, if you were to take the scenarios for the digitally distributed, the Northern Gateway scheme would require somewhere between 50 and 80% of movement to that site being made by means other than the car, all other things being equal. And in the urban zero carbon world, that would fall, but it would still be fairly significant, 40 to 60%. So whether or not that's achievable is a separate question, but it's identifying the scale of the challenge if these levels of reduction in demand are going to take place. Okay, next slide. So I think the most often asked question while we were doing that was, but is society ready for such a different future? You know, do people really want to do that? You know, politically, it's massively controversial. 71% of people feel as though they need their car for their lifestyles. And perhaps one of the reasons why this has become such a controversial subject is that we're asking the wrong question. One of our collaborators was Professor Monica Busher from the University of Lancaster, who'd been developing this process called societal readiness assessment. And she was very, very challenging, especially to me. Say, look, you're continuing to ask the wrong question. You're going to a group of people to say, look, here's an alternative set of land use and transport systems. You know, this is how you use it. You know, what do you think? Whereas what she was trying to persuade us to do was to ask the question the other way around. You know, how would this work for you? Does it fit in with your lifestyle? Does it create socially equitable solutions? Is it providing social good? Those are the sort of four questions that her societal readiness assessment is asking, because what she wants to find out is what would make you use this system. We piloted that process, and I think what we found is that it's extremely hard to do. It's very hard to explain complex land use and transport systems to a group of people and get them to understand how that might fit with a hypothetical future lifestyle. Promise me, that is really, really hard. But it did start getting leading to a way of managing difficult situations and managing conflict, where people sought to disagree with a proposal as part of one of the future scenarios. You're then actually putting the question back and saying, well, how could this change to meet the way in which your lifestyle would work? Okay, next slide, please. And we use the output of that work, of the pilot work that we did on societal readiness, to start to come up with some ideas about what these alternative futures might actually look like. Now, that work is still in progress. I have to say, we haven't developed that much further beyond this. But what was clear was what we presented as our first idea to that group of people was definitely not ready for society. We had not yet envisaged a world in which they were able to imagine themselves living in a way that was convenient to them, in a way that they would adopt, basically. So we need to shape an alternative way of looking at this. Next slide, please. And we need to use different techniques in order to help us create this alternative future. We undertook a workshop with a group of psychologists from the UCL Climate Action team back in 2021, with a series of leaders from policy making, from planning, from commercial development, residential development, and the like. And whilst almost everybody associated with that workshop were enthusiastic about making changes to get onto a net zero pathway, none of them believed it was possible, because there was always somebody else or something else or another challenge that got in the way of them being able to do it. And if you're a policymaker, one of those things is societal acceptance of what you're about to change to. And they called this learnt helplessness. And so that really is where we're now sitting as part of this study, is working out, what are the societal challenges to wanting to make some of these more radical changes? How do we make them fit for people's lifestyles? How do we use those to unlock some of the difficult challenges that policymakers face? And if we're doing that, can we unlock some of the difficulties that commercial developers might be facing in creating a new and alternative way of looking at development? And that's really our future challenge. So we have 5 key takeaways. Next slide, that I thought I'd just leave you with. We think we got some way in reimagining what a new land use future might look like for 2 different future scenarios. And there's definitely some more work to do on that. And we also made some progress about what a new transport future might look like, again, in 2 different future scenarios. But again, there's a lot of work to do on how that might provide a way in which people can live their lives in a way that they believe meets their own requirements. And then we need to place that into the context of what vision-led planning looks like. We need to have much more effective visions that are capable of taking us through the planning process. And we need to have ways in which local authorities can engage in the monitoring and the management of the outcomes of all of that, so that we're seeking to achieve a set of objectives which are, yes, about carbon, but also about better places, healthier living, better environment, and better economic outcomes. And the last thing is that all of this then leads to risk for those people who are investing in infrastructure and development. And that is not a trivial matter. We need to understand the risk that there will be for people who are either trying to promote local mobility services, who are trying to deliver new public transport services, or who are trying to promote new development in a world where everything seems to have changed. And where they need to move from capital funding models to revenue funding models. So those were sort of 5 thoughts about where different strands of work need to be taken forward from this piece of work. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Keith. Really insightful. I guess there's some questions coming through. Please add them into the Q&A function and we will start getting through them. The good news is we have about 20 minutes plus to talk through questions. I guess in terms of where you want to go with this piece of work, Keith, obviously you've mentioned to me already that you've started some presentation of these findings and sort of outreach to various groups. Thinking about collaboration, where is the next phase of this project going in terms of what Stantec want to deliver?
Okay, so well, there's various strands that we want to follow through with, and very much a sort of collaborative approach to that. So we started some work on the land use futures, and we are going to be working that up for some workshops that are going to be happening at conferences around May time, I think. So that's one piece of work that we want to try and do, and particularly to test that with local authorities, developers, and members of the representatives of local communities to see how these places fit with their future needs. So there's the land use and the transport systems, which we are looking to understand. And I think one of the things that we'd like to do is to be working more closely with providers about what these transport futures might be looking like, particularly in the technology-led world, because that world is moving pretty fast. And then we want to start working through the process of working with local authorities, developers, investors about where are these barriers for them and how can they be unpicked, and how can we create a policy and economic environment in which change can take place. Because without unpicking those things, we'll continue, all of the various actors, very well-meaning, will continue to look at each other and say, well, it's just not possible, is it?
Yeah, thank you. A couple thank you. Questions are coming through, and we're going to get through all of these, which is awesome. Just a couple of others from me. Given the urgent need to get more people to use their own car less, and particularly as you described for the 5 to 20k journeys you describe as being key to addressing transport emissions, do you think there's sufficient investment being made in behaviour change initiatives in the UK?
Do you want the short answer or the fast?
Short answer's fine.
Well, nowhere near enough, is it? But I think the other problem is that it's also not consistent enough. We held a workshop with local authorities 2 days ago, and one of the messages coming over loud and clear was about funding, about being on annual budgets, about not being able to plan forward, having to bid for money, and no leadership or guidance about what it is that they should be doing and where they should be focusing, what limited investment they've got. So all of that is missing. It's not just the fact that the money isn't there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's get to questions that are coming through, and I will just take it from the top because I think we've got plenty of time to go through these. So the first one here is about, are there any real world examples of places implementing the UZC, so that future scenario strategy successfully? In your work, was there sort of any kind of horizon scanning in terms of best practice?
Well, there was some horizon scanning, and in fairness, I think it's very, very hard to find good examples of where this is all working in the way that you would want it to. I know that the question relates to urban zero carbon, but the sort of the technology-led suburban environment, I think, is still very much in progress. There is actually a planning permission for a development in Blenheim near Oxford for a development with parking barns, which is the first one I know of. So it's got sort of community parking set aside away from the housing, and all of the housing being placed in sort of streets with no cars and the like. So that's one I've seen. I mean, I do keep on going back to Vauban in on the outskirts of Freiburg when I think about urban zero carbon, as a place that invested in a tram right at the beginning, funded it out of renewable energy investment, which was built as a result of the city's wider strategy to move towards renewables. And there was, I mean, it's getting on a bit, but these days, so the energy source is CHP, but there is no parking within the main development, and if you've been to the supermarket, you're allowed to take your deliveries in for 20 minutes, but you've got to take your car back out to the car park. So Vauban, really worth a look, I think, about how that works.
Fabulous. Thanks, Keith. Next one. What were the challenges in brief that made the plan not societal ready to be applied? So I think, yeah.
Oh, God. Sorry.
Many and varied, I'm sure.
Many and varied, yeah. So if I can just take the two separately, urban zero carbon was more simple, because what we were trying to do was to impose an urban world on a suburban environment, and that's actually what has happened in Vauban. It's 4, 5, 6-story development. It's not massive, high density, but it's more sort of medium density building blocks and remote parking and limited parking, and so putting that in a suburban environment, just people couldn't imagine themselves living without a garden. People couldn't imagine themselves living without being in their own plot. It was really fundamental stuff in urban zero carbon. Whereas in digitally distributed, I think it was more about not being able to quite see how the technology would work, and how they would be able to access it as conveniently as they do the car. And so we spent quite a long time trying to explain how a pay-as-you-go mobility service might work. And part of our imagined world, remember this is 15 years time, was that if you wanted an EV, a light EV like a Renault Twizy or something like that, to take, with a range of 80 kilometers to go to work in, you could order it to your front door. It would drive itself, because it would be autonomous in 10 or 15 years time, enough on without needing to go into highly complex autonomous mixed driving in mixed fleets out on the public road network. Out within the development, it could take itself to the development and be taken away. So you could have local mobility services being delivered right to your front door, much more conveniently than your car, and you'd be paying it for only when you used it. But that is a world which is so far removed from many people who live in a suburban environment, who don't really even use Uber, that, so that was, and making it feel as though it would work completely conveniently. That, I think, was the big barrier for them.
That's really interesting. I think, yeah. I mean, relating that to behaviour change again, isn't it? I mean, that's a critical part here in terms of taking people on that journey. So, if you're going to deploy technology, it needs to work for people. They need to understand how to use it.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, the societal readiness assessment levels were originally developed to implement individual innovations rather than systems, and so we were really stretching the boundaries with it and trying to test how far we could take that. But I think there's a real opportunity to use it, for example, in the launching of new local mobility hubs across an area, for example, which would, as a strategy, which would be much easier for people to understand. It would be much more singular and much more definable. The other thing I forgot to say in the barriers world, particularly around technology, was trust. And who is running those systems? And there was a real call for community to be involved in the delivery of those services. Anyway,
fantastic. Next one, moving on. This is brilliant. Thanks, Keith. There you go. Shout out. What are your views on the importance of location at development? Too many LPAs are still locating new development in places that are distant from destinations and therefore are inherently carbon intensive.
Absolutely, it's a critical problem. It wasn't one we were looking at specifically in here, but there are other groups that are looking at it, and engaging with local authorities, looking at how they change the local planning process. I'm trying now to remember the name of the team that's been looking at development at in Cheltenham and elsewhere, and looking at how you might be changing one development site that has a suburban development on it, and instead making it much higher density, much closer to mass transit, using local mobility services as part of the mix, and really influencing the way that that local plan seems to be turning out. So I think, you know, it's really important to influence the way in which we do that. But we're sitting in a world where we have still high housing targets, even though policy has changed slightly on that, on 5-year housing supply, and we have a massive land bank of sites that are being promoted or have been promoted through the local plan process that are suburban in nature, and so we have so whilst we have to try to change the local planning process and try and improve the way in which location works as part of planning, we are faced with the situation of having to deal with significant areas of relatively new suburban areas that are not going to be well provided for. So how do we address that? And it seems to me that the technology-led world is fundamental in addressing that.
Yeah, fabulous. Next one's a really interesting one. Talking about place I work is accessible by train, but the cost of the return journey is twice the price of driving. So I drive and park for free. Is the cost of public transport being considered for the future as well? I think this one's a really interesting one because, again, zoning in on that 5 to 20k trips that are dense and are the ones that are producing a lot of carbon. Yeah, a lot of people want, obviously, public transport. I mean, most people would agree. Do you want cheaper public transport? Of course I do. Yes. Do you want anything imposed around driving? Less so, please. But I think what's really interesting is that 5 to 20k gap is it doesn't work for active travel. I mean, very few people can sensibly make a trip beyond 5k walking. And then you've got some people who might be able to wheel. You know, might be able to, but still at the top end, that's too much in terms of a limit. So then you're really into shared mobility. You're into bus, train, and car. And from there, you know, it's helpful if there is train for somebody who's doing, and the average commute in the UK is 19 miles. That's what we found from our commuter census last year. And we run an annual commuter census. But I think that the point there is that a train will work, but perhaps 19, 20k's in a bus might not work, so therefore it's the car. Now, my thought around that is that, well, obviously car sharing has to be more of this, and particularly when you talk about the Northern Gateway forecast, 50 to 80% reduction in cars. Yeah, I just around that whole topic of the role of shared mobility. What's your thoughts in terms of getting the costs right for people?
This is fascinating. About 20 years ago, all of the then professors of transport planning wrote to the then Secretary of State saying, we desperately need to move to a system of road user charging. You will be walking into an environment where, as we move to electric vehicles and different fuels, the vehicle excise duty revenue will fall. It'll create a problem for the Treasury, and you'll need to move to a new system of charging for travel. It's not that it's been completely ignored. The Labour Party have been thinking about this for some time, but politically it's so hard for this change to be made, and nobody seems to have the wherewithal to be able to do it. And yet, I think virtually the whole of the transport planning profession would say that a different way of charging for travel is absolutely needed. And one of the questions you asked me, Graham, earlier was, how's that going to happen? And I don't think it's going to be policy-led, unfortunately. Maybe I'd love to be surprised about that, but I just don't see that happening. And so I'm imagining that this will come from private sector, a mixture of private sector, public sector innovation around local mobility services on a pay-as-you-go basis. That start creating alternatives to travel that are really attractive, particularly to the younger generation who are traveling around without using their cars much more than the older generation are, and therefore creating the environment in which then a new charging system can come into play, where we're then paying by kilometre rather than by the vehicle that we own. So I think, that's probably the way in which this is likely to happen. Therefore, the innovation around the delivery of local mobility services is absolutely fundamental. And I think local government and local providers have got a real role to play here.
That's it. That's really great. And I think it dovetails in with the next question here, which is actually thinking about from an equitable perspective, a fairness perspective. So how does your work apply to a rural coastal context where rural mobility is a challenge? And I think, that if you start to think about road user charging as you've just described, actually there is an element there in terms of consideration, in terms of fairness and equality, where if you do live in a rural environment, by definition, you will be traveling more. But then that also leads to, again, shared mobility. What's the best shared mobility concepts for rural?
Yeah, but also it's possible for the new charging systems, whenever, if ever it comes, to make allowance for the nature of the user. And so if it were to be run on a social equity basis, and it was considered politically sensible to ensure that people living in coastal areas and rural communities had greater access to cars because of where they are, then maybe there's a differential charge applied. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that, and this comes to the sort of social equity point, and it led to quite an interesting debate I had with Monica Busher on the societal readiness work. Many people who live in rural areas and coastal areas are defined by people who are either sort of living in poorer areas or people who are actually more wealthy who are living in those areas, and the people who with less available financial power are traveling less and have much lower carbon impacts. And it's actually the wealthier people who are having much higher carbon impacts, and they're capable of paying more in order to make those changes. And whilst that might seem socially inequitable in some sort of way, maybe you let the market take its own route. Because actually what we want to do is to try and influence those people who are buying SUVs and driving long distances in them and on a regular basis, and find better alternatives for them. And just from a completely pragmatic point of view, are those the sort of things that we need to start thinking about? Look, I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but that's that I think there are those tensions in future policy making that will need to be addressed. And in particular safeguard those people who don't have access to alternatives and need connectivity to services, and those need to be provided for.
Yes, thank you, Keith. Next one, there is more focus in terms of the scenarios, in terms of what you've modelled, on more focus perhaps on residential development. What themes might read across to more urban settings, i.e. CBDs, so I'm guessing central business districts, that type of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think the study took the view that that the issues faced in CBDs are very different to suburban areas. It was interesting in the local authority workshop that we ran on Monday that we had representatives from some of the major cities, so and in particular from Manchester and from Birmingham, who now have excellent city centre transport systems. It's relatively easy to move around on foot and bike and public transport and tram. But once you get out of those areas and into, if you go to in Birmingham, Moseley or Selly Oak or Sutton Coldfield or whatever, then you're into sort of lower density residential development with the same problems of many suburban and semi-rural areas. So that the problem solving, if you like, within the CBD, we can be using tried and tested urban transit, high density, high quality environment type design models to create better places in our central districts. Where we're struggling is outside of those areas, and you're right actually to point out employment particularly. As much as we have been looking at the residential site, we were also looking in part at the way in which it would access the employment site and the role that that employment site could play, being adjacent to the strategic road network, as an interchange between strategic road networks, shared transport, and local shared transport, both for freight and for passengers. It could become quite a different place and very useful from a shared mobility perspective if we were radical enough about the way in which we invented those new employment areas.
Very interesting. Yes. We're closing in on time. We've got a couple of time for a couple more, and I think questions that are being continued to come in, we will aim to answer them offline if we don't get through them all right now. The rise of car ownership and also multi-car households seems to be a key indicator of poor alternatives. How can we start the process of reversing this trend? This one, really sings to me. I mean, we are doing some work with a couple of housing developments where the intention is to try to instigate a level of understanding that we don't have, each brand new house doesn't have to have 2 cars sitting outside it. And we're trying to instigate that from the start. So a brand new development, actually making it part of the proposition is that there is car sharing between residents. So that we're starting to make things, but I think, absolutely, particularly, and this is where it particularly comes into light with residential developments, it's planning. This is based on legacy rules around planning, and we need to fundamentally change them, as you say, Keith.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing on this subject is that I've also had some contact with Professor Peter Jones at UCL on this subject over the last few years. He's been another person who's been collaborating with us on some of this work. And Peter made the point on Monday that there's a real place for providers working directly with major employers, obviously, as you are, Graham, but also health providers, education providers, and using that to figure out how they restructure not just the transport to and from their existing places, but how they change their business models. He says one of the things that has happened as a result of UCL's work with the health service is that there's been a rise of high street clinics, which has increased the take-up of people going in to use those clinics and a significant level of reduction in travel. They've looked at different ways of changing how social care is provided across an urban area and the way in which recruitment happens, and with the end result that they've changed the way that both recruitment and service provision is made, with the result of a significant level of travel reduction. So I think there's, we need to be really creative about how we go about this. We need to work at both ends of the trip journey. The reason for starting with the house and the home was that, particularly in research done by Transport for New Homes, Jenny Raggett, who did some really interesting work looking at existing developments and how they work. It was so much about the relationship between the front door and the car and the convenience of making that journey. And some of the survey work that they'd done that suggested that some people basically would get into their car, go to work 5 days a week, go to the shops, and the only time they're outside is going from the car to the front door, or the car to the office door, or the car to the shop door. so convenient and so intrinsic is that link. So one of our starting points was, can we influence and change the way in which that link works without creating places that people don't want to live in?
I think that's an interesting point around about health. I think that's a really interesting piece. And how do you weave in, as part of behavior change, that health piece? So actually reflecting and recognizing that you're not getting any exercise. The trip that you're making in the car might take 20 minutes. Public transport, overall, the trip might take 45 minutes, but let's not think about it on the basis of the component parts. 10 minutes to walk to the bus stop. It might actually only be, in terms of wheeled transport, 30 minutes versus 25 minutes in the car, and you've got 5 minutes of walk at the other end. So suddenly now, okay, it's only five more minutes in the wheeled piece, but you've added in 15 minutes of health. So I think there's some really interesting bits to play there. And I'm really interested in this high psychological behavior change aspect in terms of how we start to accelerate transport decarbonisation, because we need it. I'm very conscious of time. Thank you for everybody's attendance. Numbers have been excellent throughout, which means that we haven't been too boring. Lots of questions haven't been answered. I apologise, but they will. And we will come back to people on those. The slides will be made available. The recording, once we've sorted all of that out, we'll send that to people too. So thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.